Hello, everyone. So I will try to continue the talk that Claudia started. She explained more the physiological basis of the circuit, how the circuit was built, and I would like to show you some examples of integration of those circuits, of those models into virtual experiments, in silico experiments, and so integrating the virtual brain, well, the virtual cerebellum, in this case, with a virtual or a real body. So we will stay in the area of motor control. Motor control involves a large number of different brain areas in a hierarchical way. So we have, of course, the motor cortex, thalamus, basal ganglia, the cerebellum on the side, and we have all these feed-forward and feedback loops, different connections between the different areas. And as Claudia said, our aim is to not only focus on the cerebellum, but integrate the cerebellum with other brain areas that are involved in motor control. There are other groups that are working on other brain areas. And then we have all the body part, so the spinal cord that then transmits to motor neurons that moves muscles, and we have then all the sensory feedback that goes back up to the motor cortex and so on. So the physiological background, you have already seen it. So I will focus more on the plasticity, which is the, let's say, the main mechanism that in which we are interested because we want to have a learning system. So to have learning features, we need plasticity. And in the cerebellum, there are it's the most plastic. Cerebellum is the most plastic structure in the brain, and it has different plasticities at different sites. There are more than 15 known forms of plasticity, and in our model we have included just some of them, and we have included the cortical plasticity in the cerebellar cortex between the granular cells and the Purkinje cells, and or parallel fiber and Purkinje cell. Then also other plasticities called the nuclear plasticities, because they involve the deep cerebellar nuclei, which are another structure of the brain, of the cerebellum, between MOSI fibers and DCN, so between the input and the output, we have this direct connection between the input and the output. And then between the Purkinje cell and DCN, those are inhibitory connections. So the Purkinje cells keeps inhibited the deep cerebellar nuclei, and the change in the activity in the Purkinje cell shape the activity of the deep cerebellar nuclei, which then go to motor neurons. So we have this distributed plasticity among the different populations of the cerebellar network, and each plasticity follows its own learning rules. So we had to translate the biological changes into equations that control the changing in the synaptic weights according to the spike timings. So these are all STDPs, spike time dependent plasticity rules, and we try to model the experimental evidences measured on animals mainly, and put them as equations. So here we can see the amount of LTP and or LTD that depends on the spike timings of the pre and the postsynaptic neurons. And in the first two cases, we have heterosynaptic plasticity. So the plasticity is driven by a modulator, a third population that influence the plasticity activity, which are the inferior olive and climbing fibers for the parallel fiber Purkinje cell plasticity, and the PC activity for Purkinje cell activity for mossy fiber DCN. So we have this third population, while the last one is a more classic Hebbian STDP. So what are the functions that the cerebellum implements? It's involved in a lot of different tasks, but mainly this can be summarized as is able to predict, to generate a properly timed response, and to learn something. In motor control protocols, which are the eye blink classical conditioning that we have seen, the vestibular ocular reflex, that's the mechanism that is able to keep your eyes fixed on a target when someone is moving your head, and also the movement when you move your arm and you are perturbed by some external forces, then you are able to compensate for them. So we use the same network. We didn't change the network, and we try to apply the same network to different protocols to see if the network is able to generalize the learning capabilities of the cerebellum. So starting with the eye blink classical conditioning, we have to translate this behavioral protocol into a robotic protocol. So we have the conditional stimulus, the unconditional stimulus, and they are separated by a fixed time interval, and we need to do the same with the robot. So this is the activity of the network that is behaving as the brain, the virtual brain of the robot. And we can see that thanks to the plasticity mechanism, we have a change in the output, which is the deep cerebellar nuclei, because we have a change due to the presence of the unconditional stimulus on the Purkinje cell activity. So we have this response, the conditional response that anticipates the second stimulus, the unconditional stimulus. And we have different phases. So in the acquisition, we want to acquire the timing, and we start from a naive condition where we don't have any response. Then we learn the response, and in the extinction phase, we just provide the first stimulus, but we don't provide the second one. And the network is able to unlearn and to go back to the previous state. We have implemented the same protocol with a robot, with a now robot. So we can see in this video that the sound is not on. Okay, probably the HDMI is not propagating the audio, but okay. Okay. So the sound is the conditional stimulus, and the laser beam activation is the unconditioned one. So I don't know why it's not running the video. Okay, everything freezed. I'll resume. Let's try this again. Okay. So we have the sound, the beep, and the laser activation, and the same these two signals are also fed to the network, which is being simulated on the computer, and after some repetition, the network generates triggers the response, so the arm movement with the shield that anticipates the laser activation. So we have good conditional responses, and this was during the acquisition phase. As I was saying, during the extinction phase, you remove the unconditional stimulus, so you remove the laser. So you can see that at the beginning, the robot is still expressing the learned acquisition, but very soon the extinction is a very fast process. It goes back to the initial state. So this was an example of how we can reproduce the behavioral protocol with a robot, and to test if our model, cerebellar model, works. Another example, here we have let's say a more complex task. We don't just have to learn timing between two stimuli, but we want to express a continuous correction of a motor error. So the desired trajectory that the robot wants to perform is the blue one, this circle, and if we change the dynamics of the arm, let's say, so if we attach an additional weight to the arm, then with the predefined the feed-forward model, the actual trajectory changes, and we have then an error between the desired and the actual motor execution. So also in this case, we have used the Now robot with the same network where we have the information about the sensory proprioception of the joint positions, and then knowing the desired joint position, we can compute the error that is then fed to the inferior olive neurons. So in the baseline trial, everything works fine, but as soon as we attach the weight, we have this expected change in the performance, so the change in the trajectory executed by the robot. As soon as we continue with the repetition of this protocol, we have compensation, not ideal, but with the size of the network, this is the best that we can accomplish. That tries to go back to the desired movement. And then also here we have the extinction phase, where we remove the weight, and we can observe the after effect, so a deviation on the other direction, because the compensation of the cerebellum is no more necessary. So also in this case, we are able to quite rapidly go back to the initial condition. So this was another example of how we can integrate the cerebellar model with the robot, and to test if our model is able to learn something meaningful. And the studies that we have seen, the simulation, were performed with an anodic simulator, which is called EDLUT, that is able to guarantee real-time performances with networks of limited dimension. So the network that we have been used was it had 6,000 neurons, more or less, so not a large-scale network. So what if we want something more? So what if we want to simulate the kind of circuits that Claudia showed you? So the flocculus circuit, 1 million neurons. We cannot do that in real time, even without real time with the Heidelberg simulator. So we have to switch to something more powerful. So to do that, we can use, for example, NEST, which is a point neuron, spiky neural network simulator, where we can also define our learning rules and our different models for the neurons, and then the real time is lost, of course, if we want a network of a certain size, and so we cannot use a real robot, but we have to use a virtual one. And to the same, we need something that is able to simulate the physics of the world, to control the robot, and to control also the experiment pipeline. And this is provided by the Neurorobotics platform, the NRP. And to connect the NEST simulator with the Neurorobotic platform, we need an interface layer, which is provided by Pine. So in principle, you can use the same approach, and you can just change the simulator. You can use Neuron, for example, or Spinnaker, which are supported by Pine, and do the same with another simulator. But for our simulation, we have always been using NEST. And so some examples, well, before some caveats from my limited experience with the NRP. Here we have NRP guys, which are more expert on this. And if you want to use default models, then go with the online platform or the container or the live USB image, so the standard, the default NRP. If you need, as we needed, additional models, additional plasticity, or additional neurons, or additional robots, then you need to build the NRP from source and hack a bit with it. And yeah, also the installation, I think, is not that easy, but it's very well documented. So my suggestion is to install it on a virtual machine. There are some problems with some virtual machines, so it's better to have a dedicated partition or a disk. So, for example, I use an external SSD drive with only the system with the NRP, and that is working fine. And for local simulation, so if you right now the NRP is able to run serially, so don't exaggerate on the complexity of your network and on the robotic environment, because otherwise the simulation will slow down significantly. So some examples in which we have the same integration between the model and the brain model and the NRP. So with some students, this is really a work in progress. Some colleagues of mine are building this, let's say, parking sensor with the cerebellum. So we have this wheeled robot that goes forward because we have the green light. Then we have the monitor that turns red, kind of the alert that you are approaching the wall. But then now the robot doesn't have the cerebellum, so he continues and he hit the wall. We can see that we have the different population that encodes the motor directions, forward or reverse, and we have also some neurons that encodes the let's say the unconditional stimulus when we hit the wall. And the project aim here was to implement this parking sensor with the cerebellum. So we know we have the two stimuli, the conditional stimulus. We have a green light, and we know that after very few milliseconds we will hit the wall. So we need the cerebellum to be activated before the hitting on the wall, so to avoid the crash. So this was a simple example to provide, let's say, an example closer to something biologically meaningful. We try to reproduce this experimental protocol done with the mouse. It's a go-no-go protocol. So the go is where there is a reward, a water drop. The no-go where the reward is not there. And how the mouse knows about if the reward is there or not. Here we have a kind of a little pole that the mouse is able to sense with its whiskers. If the pole is, let's say, backward, then we have the reward. We are in a go trial. If the pole is in a forward position, then we are in a no-go trial. So they've done this experiment with both control mice and knockout mice with an LTP mechanism damage, and they've seen that a damage in the cerebellum change the percentage of correct responses in the knockout mice. And so we try to do the same. So first of all, well, this is all work done by Edoardo Negri for his master thesis this year. So we started from the mouse robot model in the NRP, and he had the whiskers because the model didn't have controllable whiskers. So he added these 4 rigid bodies at the snout of the mouse, and he also embedded all the system, the whisking system for the mouse. So we have a central pattern generator that generates the sinusoidal signals, because the whisking in the mouse is also a sinusoidal signal that is linked to the breathing rate. Then we have protectors and retractors nuclei that goes to the muscles, and then we have all the sensors, the different sensors for the whisker. The whiskers, there are whiskers that are able to, so there are sensors for the whisker that are able to detect the contact of the whisker against an object, or the detach from the object, the amount of pressure and the whisker position, and then they integrate this information that are also sent to the cerebellum controller to identify the location of the contact. So we also, in this case, we had the pole, and instead of having the pole back or forth, we had it left or right. So having it right is a go trial, and we don't have the water drop, so we have let's say this colored bar, green or red. And okay, so we have this randomized session of different trials. We have simulated this in the NRP. So we have the different neurons that can encode the whisker position, or the pressure, the contact, the detach of the whisker against the pole, and we have seen that there is a learning behavior, which in this case was not that stable, but because we didn't optimize the time constants, but we can see that in the no-go trials at the beginning we have the movement, well, the movement looking for the reward where the reward is not there, and then the number of these bad responses decrease, and the number of correct responses increase with the learning. So I had another example, but my time runs out, so I will go directly to the conclusion. So what's next? I know that the NRP is going to run in parallel, and this is thanks to the integration with HPC system. I know the guys in Lugano at CSCS are working on this. With this new, let's say, improved platform, we will be able to simulate larger networks as the one that Claudia showed you, and to have also more complex firings, so to carry out meaningful experiments with these improvements. So that's it. Thanks.